You're listening to a podcast by the Perennial Leader Project. Welcome back to Dying Every Day, Stoicism in a Year. This is day 110. On this episode, I'm sharing a clip from my previous conversation with William B. Irvine on Perennial Wisdom. Professor Irvine is the author of A Guide to the Good Life, The Stoic Challenge, and many others. In this conversation, we discuss the art of thinking well, logic from a Stoic perspective, negative visualization, and much more. All right, without any further delay, I hope you enjoy.
If you want to have a mind that's full of true and useful beliefs, full to the extent possible, if you want to optimize your mind, then you need to do two things. You need to go seeking for new, true, and useful things to believe. That is, you've got to be open-minded. And at the same time, you have to be very skeptical. You have to play the role of doorman, deciding which beliefs get in and which don't. And that same doorman is also going to be the housekeeper, in the sense that there have already been lots of false beliefs that have gotten into your mind, snuck in the undercover of darkness, and they lurk there because over the course of your life, you acquire a bunch of beliefs, from your parents, from your friends, from the internet, and so your mind is like this swamp. It's got some true stuff. It's got some really bad stuff lurking side by side. So, two jobs if you want to optimize your mind. One is welcome new beliefs, and the other is avoid and get rid of false beliefs. And there's a tension between those. But you can see that if you said, well, the goal is simply to be open-minded, well, your brain's going to be flooded with beliefs, a strange mix of true and false beliefs, and that's no good. But if you were utterly skeptical and critical, then you would have probably only true beliefs, but there'd be a whole bunch of useful true beliefs that would be outside of you. You wouldn't believe them, and you would deny them admittance, right? You're just too critical. So that's what struck me as interesting, the kind of the tension between those two things. And then the goal is to do both at the same time. And it might sound impossible, but it isn't. So, for instance, open-mindedness, what do? Well, the internet is a source of a number of different ideas about a number of different things. It's a wonderful resource, but you have to be very careful. You have to be critical. And we live in a time where we have this incredible source of information, namely the internet, and it's massively polluted. So you got to go to it thinking, okay, I'm going to be drinking water from a polluted pond. So I got to be really careful what I do. But that's the goal. You got these two contrary things, and if you care about your mind, the well-being of your mind, you got to do them both at the same time.
How do you see this connecting with Stoicism?
The Stoics actually were logicians themselves. So back in the day, this would have been, ancient Greece and then ancient Rome. Most of the philosophical schools didn't do one thing. They did multiple things. And the schools themselves were basically freestanding private universities of a sort. They had to draw students, and they did that by providing services that students or the parents of students, because these were typically, you had to pay to attend these, much more informal than modern universities are. But they had to offer something that you would find useful. And the people who went there typically were people who were headed for a career in the future in government, a legal kind of career. So, they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to sharpen up your critical thinking skills. And at the same time, we're going to tell you how to have a good life. We're going to do both of those. So the Stoics, that whole notion of sharpening your critical skills, the Stoics were the early investigators and developers of what has become known as propositional logic. And that's the logic involving if-then sentences, and sentences, or, nor, those sorts of sentences. And if you've had any computer programming, that'll ring a bell, because that's the kind of logic that's used in modern computers. That's the kind of logic. If that logic hadn't been developed, your cell phone would stop working or wouldn't have been developed. Now, I'm not saying that the Stoics invented computers or anything like that, or even invented programming, but they they developed the logical concepts on which programming is based. So here's the curious thing. So I told you about going away to college and taking philosophy classes, hoping that I would be exposed to philosophies about how to live well. And I did encounter the Stoics, but not in conjunction with their advice on how to live well, but rather in a logic class in which I encountered propositional logic. And then they mentioned, oh, by the way, the Stoics were the ones who came up with this stuff. So at first it seems odd, okay, so here's somebody who's just coming out of Stoicism, and I've written a few books now that talk about their advice on how to live well. And now I'm headed off into a critical thinking book, and that sounds like a really massive jump in interest. But in fact, the Stoics themselves were intensely interested in logic. They were also very well aware of the intrinsic irrationality of human beings. So the idea that you don't want to, like it or not, we humans, we're rational, but we also have an irrational component buried within us, and it's not going to leave. And so then the trick is how to get along with it. And their idea was what we have to do is outthink these deeper components, and to put it into the most anatomical terms, you can think about your head, which does the reasoning, and your heart and gut. So your heart is where your emotions lie. Your gut is where fear lies and fight or flight responses. And you're stuck throughout your life. You have to live with those three components. And so the trick, the insight of the Stoics was, you know what? A lot of people, their head is hijacked by their heart and their gut. So their head, instead of reasoning, which is what it's capable of doing, spends its days rationalizing. And that is coming up with reasons why the heart and gut should have whatever it is they want. In which case, comes up with clever strategies. You can be brilliant, but you're not doing it to fill your head with true and useful beliefs. It's just, your heart wants something, and so you say, oh, I got a clever way to get that. So you're not in charge anymore. But the Stoic insight was that you got to acknowledge that. And once you do acknowledge it, you've got to come up with a strategy for dealing with that. And ideally, what you do is come up with a strategy where your head can not only resist the seduction, being seduced or hijacked by your heart and gut, but where your brain can actually harness those powers and use them for the good of yourself so you can have a good life. So there's just all sorts of really interesting connections between what I was doing when I'm talking about Stoic strategies to avoid negative emotions and what I will be doing when I talk about Stoic strategies for how to avoid committing a variety of fallacies, which arise because of our hybrid nature, we got a head, but we also have a heart and gut.
How do you see that tension as you discuss between openness and skepticism? It seems that tension exists in many of the Stoic exercises. Like I think of negative visualization or memento mori, things like that. Like there's an and component with that. As you talk about kind of getting hijacked, how do you see that tension coming to play, if you do, in some of the other Stoic exercises?
Stoic those are all exercises in which you're coming up with clever ways to avoid the harm that can be done by the heart and gut. So to pick one that you mentioned, a negative visualization. It's a easy technique to use. What you do is periodically during your day, you stop to think about the loss of something that you appreciate, but probably take utterly for granted. You don't dwell on the loss of things. You don't catastrophize, the loss of things. What you do is you allow yourself to have a flickering thought about something. So the object, it can be your health, it can be your job, it can be your spouse, it can be your home. You pick what you want. It can be your children. Just give yourself a second and a half to imagine and maybe kind of visualize what it would be like if they suddenly disappeared from your life. And it can have a profound psychological effect on you because you can come away realizing how important they are to you and how utterly for granted you probably are taking them. And that's the problem with the human condition, is that there are things we want and we work really hard to get. And then once we get them, give us a little bit of time, we start taking them for granted. And then we get new desires. And then so we think, well, I got to get that new thing that I want, 'cause I'll live happily ever after this time. Promise, swear to God, I will. And then we work hard, we get them. And at first, it's a great thing. And then give ourselves a little bit of time and it wears off and we start taking it for granted. So Stoic insight was, you know what? The thing to do is learn how to want things you already have, how to deeply appreciate them. Otherwise, you're on a wild goose chase. You're always going to be thinking, this next thing will do it for me, but it won't. In my life, one thing, and this isn't true just of Stoicism, but it's true if you do meditation, a variety of things, is you realize that you have a front row seat for what's going on in your mind. You get to watch it. Besides thinking, you get to think about how you're thinking. Besides experiencing desires, you get to think about, where are those desires coming from, and what am I doing with them? And you become aware of, gosh, I'm just exposed to this flood, this tsunami of desires, and what I've got to do is pick through them. And just because I find them in me, it doesn't follow that it's what I should want. And you start becoming skeptical of your own desires. A desire pops into your head, and then you start thinking, really what I want? Or is that something somebody planted in my mind? And if it is, shouldn't I just dismiss it? My life would be simpler if I did. But anyway, there's this tension. And I know that in my days, now that I watch what I think and so on, it's amazing to me. Okay, so I've made it my point to study Stoicism and these techniques. And one thing that I find amazing is if I get good news out of the blue, I get an email that's good news, you get a little buzz, you got good news. And what's amazing to me is how quickly it dissipates. We're talking hours where, you go from thinking, this is great, to, just it becomes background. Yeah, this is just the way my life is, and that's a shame. I know that I'm a very lucky human being. If I were born 100 years ago, the things that I'm able to do with my life, I couldn't do. I wouldn't have indoor plumbing. You go through the list, maybe more like 150 years ago. And yet those people not only got along, but they seemed pretty happy. And I look around me and people who have all this incredible stuff. The cell phone is a miracle. You can order pizza in Hong Kong with a cell phone, with a cell phone. And in fact, you can even look at the face of the person you're ordering it from. I don't know why anybody would want to do that. But the point is you could do that. And yet you have these people who are just miserable. Yeah, but I don't have the latest model cell phone. Take pity on me. Okay, well, you can live your life that way, but there is an option, and that is just to become aware of what you've got and to embrace what you've got.
Thank you for listening to Dying Every Day, Stoicism in a Year. I hope you found something useful for daily life. If you enjoy what we're doing here and want to support the project, consider becoming a Perennial Meditations member. And finally, as always, I urge you to put what you heard into practice. Until next time, be wise and be well.